All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Mokak Oration. I am Danielle Wood, Chair of the Productivity Commission, and I am delighted to be joining you this evening on beautiful Ngunnawal Ngambri land. Big thank you to the Treasury for hosting us here this evening. Toilets, for those that need them, are just to your right there. Exit is the way that we came in. We are recording for live stream tonight. Hi, everyone on the live stream. We'll also be putting this up on the Productivity Commission website. So if anyone in the audience would prefer not to appear in the recording, please let one of the PC staff know. We are going to start this evening's proceedings with a welcome to country from Auntie Violet Sheridan. Auntie Violet, as many of you would know, is an esteemed Ngunnawal elder. She is a respected leader within the Canberra community and the surrounding regions. She is recognised for her commitment and passion to sharing her cultural knowledge, and we are very lucky to have her this evening to welcome us to Ngunnawal country.
Yuma, good evening everybody, and let's get things straight. This was and always will be Ngunnawal country. This is my mother's land, and it will always will be Ngunnawal land. Why I know this, I'm 70-year-old and I grew up here. Thank yous. But before I go into my welcome, I would like to acknowledge the Honourable Ken Wyatt, who I'm really, really looking. I haven't seen you for a while until you retired. So I'm looking forward to hearing you speak tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge Auntie Pat Anderson and Romlie Mokak and other guests that's in the room, as well as always Jenny Wilkinson, Treasurer Secretary. And I'd also like to acknowledge my sister Mary in the room as well. Well, I stand here, right here, this evening, where my ancestors before me practiced culture, raised family. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit, walking into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Ngunnawal Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people here this evening and online. But I'd also like to acknowledge the non-Indigenous people in the room and online as well. In keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to my mother's country, the land of the Ngunnawal people. Always was, always will be. Ngunnawal land, Ngunnawal Aboriginal culture. On behalf of my sister Mary and our family, and the other Ngunnawal families, once again, say welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Auntie Violet. That was a wonderful way to kick off the oration. I would also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. I know we have many senior Indigenous leaders joining us tonight in the room and on the live stream. I won't try and mention you all, but we are really honoured to have you here, and thank you for joining for tonight's conversation. Can I also welcome the senior government leaders in the room, alongside a number of our current and former commissioners and PC staff. This is, of course, the Mokak Oration, so I'd like to especially recognise Romlie Mokak, the PC's first Indigenous Policy Commissioner. Rom is a proud Jugun man and a member of the Yaru people. He joined the PC after a long and distinguished policy and research career, and he very much made a lasting impression at the Commission. Rom was instrumental in delivering our first review of the Closing the Gap agreement. Rom, you won't believe it, but we're about to kick it off again. He also led a number of other reviews and research projects, from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts and Crafts Inquiry to the Housing and Homelessness Agreement Review. But Rom's legacy at the PC is not just about the projects that he helped oversee, but in the way that we work. Rom emphasised the need to properly engage with and work alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, organisations and communities. He challenged the PC to work in ways where Indigenous knowledge and Western methodologies coexisted rather than competed. And that work continues today through the PC's very recent release of a report profiling government organisations and how they're delivering against Priority Reform 3, and through Stephen Walter's excellent work in developing the PC's first Reconciliation Action Plan. But it was really to recognise Ron's broader legacy that we introduced the Mokak Oration as an annual event to celebrate the achievements and contributions of prominent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to Australian public policy. The oration has its own artwork that you can see there from the very talented Lani Balzan. The piece narrates Rom's significant contribution and the unity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with the broader Australian community. I really invite you to engage with the piece, and you can read more about it in Lani's words on the PC website. Now, our first Mokak orator was Rom himself. For those of you that were in the room, you will recall it was a powerful speech and there was barely a dry eye in the house. And I could think of no one better to follow that act than tonight's speaker, the formidable Ken Wyatt AM. I'll introduce Ken in a moment, but the format tonight is Ken will deliver the oration. I'll then invite Treasury Secretary Jenny Wilkinson to offer some brief reflections on the address. And then for those in the room, there'll be a chance to have a drink and some things to eat and to reflect on the oration. So with that, let me introduce Ken. The Honourable Ken Wyatt AM JP served as the member for Hasluck in the Federal Parliament from 2010 to 2022, the longest ever serving member of the Hasluck electorate. He was the first Indigenous Australian elected to the House of Representatives, and the image of Ken in the kangaroo skin buka on his first day in Parliament, I think, is one of the iconic images of Australian politics. Ken went on to be the first Indigenous Australian appointed to the Commonwealth Ministry and the first Aboriginal Australian to serve in Cabinet when he was appointed Minister for Indigenous Australians between 2019 and 2022. It was in that role that Ken was able to secure the historic national agreement on closing the gap. He also pioneered the National Roadmap on Indigenous skills, jobs and wealth creation, and was instrumental in the Commonwealth Government securing the copyright to the Aboriginal flag. Ken made important contributions as the Minister for Aged Care, Minister for Indigenous Health and Minister for Aged Care and Senior Australians. Before entering politics, he worked in the public service roles in health, education and Aboriginal affairs in the Western Australian and New South Wales governments. In his extensive and broad-ranging career in life, Ken has made an enormous contribution to the wider community. This was recognised in 1996 when he was awarded the Order of Australia, and in 2000, the Centenary of Federation Medal. Ken, a huge thank you for joining us. We're really honoured to have you here this evening. Can everyone please join me in welcoming Ken to deliver the 2025 Mokak Oration.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we gather this evening, the Ngunnawal peoples, and pay my deep respect to their elders past and present. And Auntie Violet, I thank you for your welcome to country. And it's always good when you meet with the elders of the traditional country on which you walk and leave your footprints. I also want to acknowledge Rom. I've watched your career over a long period of time and watched you grow into those leadership roles of which you've taken an exemplary pathway. I also want to acknowledge Danielle Woods, the Productivity Commission Chair, also Jenny Wilkinson, Treasury Secretary. Pat Anderson, I acknowledge you for your contribution, and all of our First Nations people who are online or in this room for your contribution, and to everybody else who makes up this great nation of ours. Because it is important that we remember that we are working on Mother Earth for a common good and a common direction. May our words tonight honour the continuity of the elders, their sovereignty, their law and their care for country that was never ceded and has never been broken. When I stand here and speak of releasing the shackles, I speak not of a metaphor alone. I speak of iron and chains. I speak of laws and policies. I speak of invisible restraints that bind opportunity, silence voices and hold back futures. The shackles of the past were visible: cold steel on the wrist or ankles, padlocks on the gates, signs that said forbidden. Colonisation brought violence, control and dehumanisation. Men, women and children, Aboriginal people, were shackled during punitive expeditions, shackled as prisoners on their own country, shackled for daring to resist. Communities were confined to reserves, wages stolen, languages silenced, ceremonies banned, kinship broken, poor health and deprived of educational opportunities. The so-called Protection Acts were shackles written into law. They dictated where Aboriginal people could live, when they could leave, and how they would work, and even claim guardianship over their children. These were not benign policies. They were calculated to control, to confine, to erase. And yet through all of this, our people endured. The culture endured from the Stone Age to the Iron Age and beyond. The fire endured, and individuals led policy, institutional and social reform through their personal vision, passion and determination over 4 decades. The Productivity Commissioners represent the voices of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in their reports to government to influence change. Releasing the shackles in those days would have meant more than cutting chains. It would have meant recognition of sovereign nations, restoration of dignity, the right to live on, and to live on country according to our own laws, governance and the ways of knowing. In the summer of 1938, an elderly Yorta Yorta man walked the streets of Melbourne carrying a petition. His name was William Cooper. His handwriting was steady, his conviction unshakable. The petition sought recognition, not charity, not pity, but recognition of Aboriginal people as citizens and as the first custodians of this land. He walked door to door, pen in hand, heart on fire. William Cooper had no office, no funding, no legal standing. What he possessed was moral clarity, and that clarity cracked the first shackle of Australians' indifference. He believed that conscience, even when wielded by one man, could shame a nation into seeing itself clearly. When Parliament refused to receive his petition, he did not surrender. He organised the Day of Mourning, the first national political protest by Aboriginal people. And later that same year, upon hearing of the Nazi program against Jewish people in Germany, William Cooper led a delegation to the German consulate in Melbourne, the only known private citizen to protest against the Night of the Long Knives anywhere in the world. In that act, William Cooper broke the first of Australia's shackles, the shackle of silence. He showed that moral conscience of this country would be measured not by its comfort, but by its courage. William Cooper's generation planted the seed of resistance, and later generations watered it with intellect, vision and reform. His petition opened a door that others would stride through decades later. The 1967 referendum, the land right movements of the 1970s, and the rise of the Aboriginal legal and health services all owe something to that moral beginning. But each era faced its own shackles: ignorance, exclusion and paternalism. And each demanded leaders who could turn protest into policy. He taught us that the conscience of this nation would never again rest easy while its first people were denied dignity. Cooper's courage lit a fire that others have carried forward through education, governance, law, health and culture, transforming grievance into governance and protest into policy. The first shackles broken was silence itself. Cooper gave voice to the voiceless, and generations since have turned that moral voice into institutional change. And I'm going to mention a few of our Indigenous leaders. There are many who I could have included, because the wealth of leadership from the community level through to state and territory and national is evidenced by the many who have stood and influenced the directions that institutions and governments have taken. And to those I apologise, but I want to focus on a few to show how the shackles were broken. Dr. Lowiger O'Donoghue was a proud Yankajara woman who emerged from a very challenging circumstance to become one of Australia's foremost Indigenous leaders and change makers. Excuse me. Her life and work are deeply relevant to the themes of Indigenous self-determination, equity, health and governance, and reconciliation. Her life embodies resilience, that overcoming of the structural disadvantage and the transformation of adversity into leadership. Dr. O'Donoghue did not simply represent Indigenous interests. She institutionalised Indigenous leadership into policy, health and governance. The shackles that Dr. O'Donoghue broke were cultural dispossession, transformed the trauma of removal and loss of identity into lifelong commitment to restoring dignity and the voice of the stolen generation. She defied systemic exclusion by becoming the first Aboriginal nurse trained in the Royal Adelaide Hospital, opening professional doors for Indigenous Australians. She broke through government and bureaucratic barriers to lead ATSEC, embedding Indigenous leadership into national decision-making. She helped shape the Native Title Act in 1993 with many others, breaking Australia's historical refusal to recognise Indigenous land ownership and sovereignty. She shattered perceptions of Indigenous incapacity by asserting a powerful, articulate presence on the national and international stage. In the story of this nation, there are those whose courage did more than challenge injustice. They broke its shackles. Two such men that stand out are Patrick Lionel Jargon Dodson and Charles Nelson Perkins. Both stand as towering figures of conscience and change. Pat Dodson, born in Broome, carries the wisdom of the Yaru people and the heart of a peacemaker. Ordained as Australia's first Aboriginal Catholic priest, he moved beyond the walls of the church to enter the heart of the nation's unfinished business, justice and reconciliation. As Commissioner into the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, as Chair of the Council of Reconciliation, and as a Senator for Western Australia, he guided us towards the truth that reconciliation is not an act of charity, it is an act of nationhood. He broke the shackle of exclusion, the long silence that kept First Nations voices outside the design of reconciliation itself. Through his moral clarity, he brought those voices to the centre, insisting that reconciliation be shaped with us, not for us. And Charles Perkins, from the red earth of the Alice Springs Telegraph Station, rose a man whose defiance reshaped a nation's conscience. He led the 1965 Freedom Ride, confronting segregation and the quiet cruelty of racism that scarred our towns and our spirit. He became the first Aboriginal graduate of an Australian university and the first to lead a government department, transforming protest into policy and struggle into structure. He broke the shackle of structural racism, proving that intellect, persistence and integrity could dismantle centuries of exclusion. His voice did not ask permission, it demanded justice. Eddie Mabo turned law into justice and justice into truth for all of us. He was a teacher, an activist, a custodian who stood against the might of a nation's denial, the lie that this land was terra nullius, a land belonging to no one. Born on Mur in the Torres Strait, he carried with him a truth that could no longer be silenced, that his people had owned, cared for, and belonged to their land since time immemorial. And from the islands of the Torres Strait came a voice that would shake the foundations of the law itself. With quiet conviction and relentless truth, he carried his people's story all the way to the High Court of Australia, and there he changed history. He broke the shackle of legal denial, the falsehood that this continent was empty before 1788. Through his courage, the High Court recognised what Indigenous people had always known, that the land has owners, custodians, stories and spirit. His victory was not only a change in law, it was a restoration of the truth. Eddie Mabo's legacy reminds us that justice often begins with one voice, willing to challenge the silence. He transformed a nation's legal doctrine into a moral awakening, proving that truth once spoken cannot be buried. Together, Dodson, Perkins and Mabo formed a trinity of courage, faith, defiance and truth. They remind us that freedom is not found in anger, but in purpose, not in division, but in courage. Their legacies are not relics of the past, they are instructions for our future. Dr. Paula Hughes, a Cockatha man and one of our first Aboriginal teachers, looked around the classrooms of South Australia and said, "Where are our stories? Where are our children?" From that question grew the National Aboriginal Education Policy, a framework that shifted education from a tool of assimilation to a pathway of self-determination. Dr. Hughes was one of Australia's most respected Indigenous education reformers and policy leaders, whose work has transformed national approaches to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education, leadership and cultural inclusion. Dr. Hughes broke the epistemic shackle, the idea that knowledge flowed only in one direction. As a reformer, he built bridges between government and community, and whose legacy continues to shape the educational and social aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Professor Marcia Langton, AO, is among Australia's most influential public intellectuals and advocates for Indigenous rights. Her decades-long career has shaped national debates on land rights, education, economic development and social justice, and many other issues. Professor Langton, through scholarship and policy, forced Australia to confront its intellectual exclusion of Indigenous peoples. Her work made it impossible to write about the nation without writing about us, not about us, and writing with us. Her leadership in the Indigenous Voice co-design process and her ongoing advocacy for Indigenous economic empowerment reflects her deep influence on our national governance. Marcia's intellect and courage challenged the institutions to reckon with both history and responsibility. Langton showed that ideas can be weapons if they are sharpened by truth and wielded with precision. Together, Hughes and Langton broke the epistemic shackle, the belief that education was a one-way transmission of Western truth rather than a shared conversation of our cultures. Professor Tom Kalmer is a distinguished advocate, public servant and policy reformer, whose leadership has shaped national frameworks in health, education and Indigenous governance. And there are many in the health arena that I could equally name. Professor Kalmer took the ideals of justice and measured them with evidence. As Social Justice Commissioner, he spearheaded the Close the Gap campaign, embedding Indigenous health and equality into the national agenda, Later, as co-chair of the Indigenous Voice co-design, Kelma helped define pathways for structural inclusion within government. He reminded Australia that justice cannot be felt until it can be measured. Through the Close the Gap framework, he embedded accountability into the nation's conscience. Policy, he taught us, must not only promise, it must report. Kelma's enduring legacy lies in his capacity to unite community vision with institutional reform, embodying the Oration spirit of pragmatic, inclusive and accountable leadership. And Noel Pearson, through the Cape York reforms, showed that Indigenous policy need not oscillate between dependence and abandonment. He built frameworks of empowerment, welfare reform, education reform and local governance, rooted in culture, but fluent in economics. Noel has been one of the most influential Aboriginal thinkers and reformers in modern Australian policy. His ideas have repeatedly influenced both Labor and coalition governments, showing his ability to bridge ideology in services of pragmatic reform. He brings a unique perspective that links self-determination with responsibility and opportunity, echoing themes that resonate across government, academia and community policy circles. Pearson translates community realities into policy innovation. He challenges policy institutions like the Productivity Commission to rethink entrenched systems and focus on empowerment rather than paternalism. He spoke of responsibility with rights, of communities not managed but entrusted. Both have broken the shackle of fatalism, the quiet, cohesive belief that nothing could change. Today, our challenges are different but no less heavy. The shackles of ignorance have been replaced by the shackles of inertia. We have moved from exclusion to inclusion, but too often, inclusion without influence. The question for this generation is not, are we seen? It is, are we heard when decisions are made? If the past shackled us in exclusion, the present shackles us in inertia. No longer visible, but too often unheard. No longer excluded, but too rarely empowered. The challenge now is not visibility, but voices with consequence. From policy recipients to policy designers, we have some outstanding leaders who have influenced the forward thinking of this nation. Professor Megan Davies carried David Cooper's petition into the Constitution itself. Her leadership, along with others of the Uluru Dialogue, redefined recognition, not as poetry on paper, but as participation in power. As an architect of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, she reframed recognition as structure, not symbol. Through hundreds of dialogues, she and others built consensus, not around charity, but around voice. She built through careful dialogue a blueprint for shared governance. The Voice, Treaty and Truth trilogy that continues to guide us. Her work exposes the next frontier of freedom, of structural inclusion. Commissioner Selwyn Button, who's commenced on a journey, represents a new kind of leadership, Indigenous governance within the machinery of the state. He is not outside knocking on the door, he is inside redesigning the room. From the Productivity Commission to the Office of the Register of Indigenous Corporations, his work has embedded accountability, data and transparency into policy systems that only managed Indigenous people's lives from afar. He has proved that the next frontier of self-determination lies not only in protest, but in policy architecture. Commissioner June Oscar and Professor Pat Dudgeon AM have transformed how we measure wellbeing. June Oscar's, and I'm going to get this wrong, We Yani You Thingani project elevated the collective voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. A revolution in consultation and design reminding us that policy must begin where life begins, in the strength of women, families and communities. Pat Dudgeon's the nation's first Aboriginal psychologist, replaced the vocabulary of pathology with the language of pride. Dudgeon's leadership in mental health reform through the Gaia Dewey Proud Spirit Declaration wove cultural strength into the national health frameworks. Together, they shattered the deficit lens and replaced it with a strength-based model of resilience, belonging and collective healing. Together, they broke the shackle of deficit, the cruel idea that Indigenous identity was a problem to be solved rather than a source of strength to be shared. After the Voices referendum, the country stood in a rare moment of quiet, a silence heavy with disappointment, but also charged with possibility. And we heard the voices of Marcia Langton, Noel Pearson, Rachel Perkin and many others remind us that progress does not vanish with a vote. The quest for a fair relationship between First Nations and the state is not a campaign, it is a continuum. Truth-telling, they insist, is not a threat to national unity. It is its foundation. To hide our history is to chain our future. But there is another kind of shackle, the shackle of forgetting. And to break that, a nation needs storytellers. Rachel Perkins, a proud Orantian Kakadoon woman, has become one of the great truth tellers of our time through film, documentary and advocacy. She has turned history into public memory and storytelling into civic duty. In First Australians, she chronicled the unspoken history of this land, not as a tragedy alone, but as an endurance. In the Australian War, she made visible what our textbooks hid, the frontier violence that shaped our national landscape. And through her leadership in the Uluru Dialogue, she carried truth-telling into policy reform, arguing that a nation cannot legislate justice if it cannot first remember its own story. Rachel Perkins broke the shackle of national amnesia. She reminded us that truth-telling is not an act of division, it is an act to repair. That a country's soul cannot heal while the history remains untold. Her work stands as a cultural mirror to Megan Davies' constitutional vision. One tells the story, the other writes the structure. I turn to our Prime Ministers and the politics of hope. While breaking the shackles in Indigenous affairs has always begun with the moral courage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, there have been moments when Prime Ministers have acted with vision and helped remove parts of those historical chains. Some acted deliberately. Others did so by accident, provoked by Indigenous determination. From the reluctant missteps of William McMahon, whose rejection of land rights in 1972 ignited the tent embassy, to the bold reforms of Gough Whitlam, who returned land to the Gurindji people and outlawed racial discrimination. Political will occasionally aligned with moral justice. Whitlam's handful of red dirt poured into Vincent Lingari's palm remains one of the most defining images of dignity restored. Excuse me. A gesture that transformed the relationship between government and Aboriginal from one control to one of respect. Malcolm Fraser carried Whitlam's legacy forward, embedding human rights into law and delivering the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act in 1976, while expanding Indigenous representation in public life. His quiet decency and commitment to bipartisanship broke the shackles of bipartisanship that had been long paralysed in the reforms. Bob Hawke offered the language of reconciliation, creating ATSEC, supporting the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and committing through Unrealised to a treaty process. He was a leadership of consensus, giving form to the ideas that reconciliation required shared governance and not mere sentiment. Paul Keating's tenure turned truth into policy. In his 1992 Redfern Park speech, he shattered decades of denial by naming what the nation had done: the theft of land, the destruction of culture, the removal of children. Under his government, the Native Title Act 1993 and the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation gave legal and moral authority to those truths. Keating broke the shackles of denial. His courage reminded Australians that political power is its most transformative when it serves historical honesty. His successors continued to work in different ways. John Howard's contradictions reopened difficult debates on autonomy and protection. Kevin Rudd's 2008 national apology broke the shackles of shame, transforming empathy into policy and restoring humanity to the national story. Julia Gillard brought compassion and discipline, embedding accountability through the Closing the Gap framework, while Malcolm Turnbull's rejection of the Uluru Statement paradoxically reignited public determination for recognition. Under Scott Morrison, shared decision-making with the Coalition of Peaks marked a shift towards co-design, embedding Indigenous organisations as partners in the policy process. And Anthony Albanese, though unsuccessful in 2023 referendum, demonstrated the courage of invitation, offering Australian people the chance to write equality into the Constitution and opening a door to truth-telling and treaty that will not close again. Every act of progress in Indigenous policy has required two forms of courage: moral courage from leaders such as William Cooper, June Oscar and Rachel Perkins and others, and political courage from those in government who choose to listen and legislate. When these two forms of courage converge, nations change. When they diverge, history stalls. From Whitlam's Red Earth to Keating's Truth in Redfern, from Rudd's apology to Morrison's Closing the Gap in partnership with Indigenous Australians, to Albanese's invitation, each act loosened one more link in the chain that bound this country to its unfinished past. Yet as long as equality depends on good rule rather than law, the work remains incomplete. Each Prime Minister who dared to listen helped lift one of the shackles from the nation's soul. But only when justice is embedded not as a promise but as a principle will Australia be truly free to them all. Across those 14 leaders, we can see a pattern: the architecture of Indigenous reform in motion. Moral authority, we can rest with William Cooper, Lowiger, Charlie Perkins, Dodson, Kelmer, who turned conscience into commitment. Knowledge and education, Hughes, Langton, Dudgeon translated experience into evidence. Structural power, Davis, Button and Rom and Pearson redesigned the institutions themselves. Cultural memory, Perkins and Oscar gave voice to the emotional truth of our history. Each teaches us that liberation is not a single act, but a system built differently. The true freedom is the ability to participate in designing the future. But even as we honour progress, we must confront the new constraints. System inertia, where bureaucracy outlasts vision. Fragmentation, where culture is divided by portfolios. Moral fatigue, where the public mistake apology for closure. And economic inequality, where prosperity has not yet found its way to country and to community. These are the soft shackles, polished, polite but powerful. They exist not in laws but in habits, not in prejudice but in process. They remind us that colonisation was never just an event. It is a system that must continually be redesigned out of existence. There are legacies of well-meaning reform without enduring architecture, and they will persist until we embed Indigenous design into the institutions of the state. If William Cooper's petition was the moral beginning, the unfinished business of our time is the structural completion. Structural completion and inclusion means more than consultation. It means Indigenous people authoring the policies that govern Indigenous lives. It means accountability written into legislation, not into footnotes. It means governments listening, not once, but always. The Uluru Statement from the Heart remains our compass. It invites Australians to walk with us in a moment of Australian people for a better future, not through guilt, but through shared governance. The 2023 referendum may not have changed the Constitution, but it changed the nation's conversation. It revealed how far we've come and how far we are yet to travel. And it reminds us that the defeat is never final when the cause is just. The 2023 referendum was not the end of the road, it was a crossroad. The nation was asked whether it would enshrine a voice. Many said no. But even in that no, there was something remarkable. The most sustained national conversation on Indigenous justice since Federation. That conversation must not end. Structural inclusion remains the unfinished business of this nation. It is the final step in breaking the shackles, not through blame, but through balance. It means designing systems with us, not for us. It means embedding our participation in every level of decision-making, from cabinet to community boardrooms. It means truth in data, respect in design, and partnership in practice. Imagine Australia with the moral conviction of Cooper meets the constitutional craftsmanship of Davis, where the intellectual precision of Langton meets the pragmatism of Pearson, where they converge to design policy that is both just and effective, where the compassion of Oscar meets the clarity of Kelmer, where the cultural fires of Lowiger, Charles and Rachel Perkins illuminates the path that Button, Dudgeon and others continue to build, where Button's generation governs with transparency and Dudgeon and Hughes' legacies shape education and well-being as tools of nation building. That Australia is not a dream. This is not a dream of separation, but a build and a better build for all of our children and grandchildren. It is already forming in classrooms, in commissions, in communities, and I should say also in many corporate organisations. It exists wherever courage meets compassion and wherever governments learn to listen, not to manage, but to trust and empower. William Cooper once said, "If we have no voice, we must create one. If we have no place, we must build one." He built it with petitions. Others have built it with policy, law and love. And there are many others who've contributed to this. Tonight, as we gather in the spirit of Romlie Mokak, a man who taught the Commission to listen, to act, and that data and dignity can coexist. He proved that data can be a language of dignity, that evidence, when handled with respect, becomes not a tool of measurement, but a mirror of justice. The Mokak Oration exists because of that insight. That policy must have a pulse, and that numbers must always tell a human story. So as we gather here tonight, let us honour the architects of our freedom, not for what they've built, but for what they continue to challenge us to imagine. The moral arc of this nation bends slowly, but it bends towards justice when we choose to guide it. When William Cooper carried his petition to Parliament, he sought not revenge, but recognition. When Rachel Perkins filmed the stories of our frontier, she sought not division, but truth. And when this generation carries the legacy forward, they will seek not an apology, but equity written into the laws of the land. Let this be the generation that finally understands freedom is not achieved when the last chain is broken. It is to melt the metal itself, to reshape the institutions that forge those chains into instruments of inclusion. Let us remind the Australian Public Service that policy is never neutral. It either liberates or it limits. And let it remind every Australian that reconciliation is not a destination but a discipline, a daily act of courage, curiosity and care. And as Rom said, let us turn policy into partnership. Let us turn remembrance into reform. This may be the era where Australia at last breaks not only the shackles of the past, but also the subtle, sophisticated shackles of now, and that we walk together unbound into a just and shared future, and for our children and our grandchildren and future generations of Australians. Thank you.
Thank you hugely, Ken. It's an incredibly powerful speech and one that I think helps chart a way forward through policy, and there's probably no better room to have that conversation in, and probably no better person to offer a response than Treasury Secretary Jenny Wilkinson. Jenny, who probably needs no introduction in this room, became Secretary of the Treasury in June this year. Before that, she was Secretary of the Department of Finance from 2022. She has worked in the Australian Public Service for more than 30 years, and her previous jobs include Deputy Secretary at the Treasury and the Head of the Parliamentary Budget Office. In 2021, Jenny won a Public Service Medal for her work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jenny is also one of the most thoughtful policy practitioners I know, and I can't think of a better person to respond to Ken's fantastic oration. So thank you and welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Danielle. What a powerful oration. I found that both incredibly optimistic, thinking about where we've come from, and then challenging in terms of thinking about what we have before us. But thank you just so much, Ken, for providing such a deeply moving oration this year. And thanks to the Productivity Commission for convening this important event. It really is a privilege to offer a response to a speech that just so eloquently traces the arc from moral courage to structural justice. And I think it really does challenge all of us as public servants to walk this path with integrity and with purpose. I first met Ken during his tenure as Minister for Aged Care, and it struck me then at a forum at Parliament House that he had a remarkable ability to bring diverse stakeholders together. In that case, it was from service providers to older Australians to members of the financial community. And he was really clearly committed to reforms that had dignity, respect, and cultural safety at their core. In my experience, Ken's leadership in that policy area just showed how collaborative policy development can translate vision into impact. The Mokak Oration that Ken delivered this evening reminds us that injustice has historical origins, but also that it's perpetuated through continuing structural and systemic practices. Progress to reform these systems and practices has been an ongoing movement, and that spanned decades, from William Cooper's petition to Megan Davis's constitutional vision. The oration speaks to the courage of leaders who broke the shackles of silence, of exclusion and deficit thinking, but I think it very usefully highlights what some of the different restraints are today: inertia, fragmentation, and moral fatigue. As members of the Australian Public Service, we are really all called upon not just to listen to such a great oration, but to act. The oration makes it clear that policy may liberate or it may limit. And for me, I think our responsibility is to ensure that our work in every portfolio, in every program, in every reform, is a tool of liberation. When Romlie delivered the inaugural oration, named in his honour last year, he spoke of the importance of putting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the centre of public policy. And this really is where the Closing the Gap priority reforms offer an important framework. We need to keep reminding ourselves that they call for formal partnerships and shared decision-making, not just in principle, but in practice. They call for building the Indigenous community-controlled sector, recognising that self-determination begins with self-governance. They call for transforming government organisations, making sure they're culturally safe, they're responsive and they're inclusive. And they call for shared access to data and information so that communities can shape their futures with evidence and with agency. It's not enough to consult, we must work in genuine partnership. It's not enough to include, we must empower. It's not enough to measure, we must use data and evidence to shape policy and improve outcomes. In my view, the First Nations Economic Partnership that has recently been announced is a powerful example of how the government is doing this to shape First Nations economic policy. The Economic Partnership demonstrates the value of co-design and shared decision-making, bringing together First Nations organisations, experts and government to advance economic empowerment and build lasting prosperity. It's an important vehicle for government and First Nations leaders of today and tomorrow to progress investment, business, employment, trade and commercial opportunities in First Nations communities. The partnership offers a chance for those of us in the public service to learn more about successful initiatives and to consider how these can be scalable and transferable to different settings. And in doing so, we have to be open to innovation and embracing different ways of working. During Ken's maiden speech to Parliament, he spoke about the pathfinders that are needed to accelerate change to improve outcomes for future generations. He said, and I quote, "As pathfinders, we forge the way forward and we draw the maps and pathways for the future generations of Australians. As pathfinders, we have to commit to and fight for change. We have to plan for a society that should exist for all Australians in 2030 and 2050. As public servants, we need to recognise and honour the legacy of those who have been the pathfinders by remembering their courage, by supporting their vision, and by continuing their important work. But more than that, we need to ensure that we're not passive witnesses to history, but are pathfinders ourselves and active architects of a better future. Thank you once again, Ken, for a fabulous oration. Can you all join me in thanking Ken for a great...
Thanks hugely, Jenny, for those characteristically thoughtful remarks, and we're certainly looking forward to cataloguing some of that progress and some of the distance still to go in our upcoming review of the Closing the Gap agreement. Thank you again, Ken, for a wonderful address. As I said at the start, really the purpose of the Mokak Oration is to celebrate the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through policy, and you've very much given us that tonight. You know, it's also very much a work in progress, as you point to, and I think some of the future leaders are here this evening, including, well, Selwyn's not here, but our own Commissioner, Selwyn Button, that you mentioned in the oration. Before we wrap up the formalities, thank you again to Treasury for providing the event space. Particular thank you to Michelle Mullave and to Brett and Mark from the Property and Logistics team who fielded questions and helped set up this evening. It does take a village to put on an event like this. A big thank you to our PC Village, to Liz, to Jolyn, Kath, who's snapping away, Julie, Nat, Chris, Anjali, Kate, Tiernan, Michelle and Heather for all your efforts this evening. And thank you to each and every one of you for attending tonight's oration. As I said, the recording will be available on the website, I think in about 2 weeks' time. I hope some of you will be back next year. I will say goodbye now to those on the live stream. To those in person, please join us for some drinks and canapes and continue the conversation. Thank you.